What philosophy is seems to be inseparable from the question how to read Plato. Now, almost no philosopher after Plato wrote at length about philosophy, and from antiquity at least, there are few notices that inform us about the principles of Platonic writing. Three, however, stand out. The first two, in Plutarch and Cicero respectively, point directly to the issue of esotericism. The third, in Alienation, to the very nature of philosophy. Plutarch implies that by the subordination of natural necessities to more divine principles, Plato made philosophy safe for the city. Not surprisingly, this remark is made in his biography of Nicias. And in the Tusculan Disputations in Book 5, Cicero remarks that he followed the way of Socrates as it was made known by Plato in his own dialogues, in concealing his own opinions, relieving others of error, and seeking in every dispute what is most like to the truth. Aelian tells the story of the painter Pauson, who was hired to paint a racehorse rolling in dust, and instead painted it running. And when his patron objected, Pauson told him to turn it upside down. And Aelian says that there was much talk to the effect that this resembled the speeches of Socrates. It was the extraordinary merit of Leo Strauss to experience the import of these three remarks, among others, and render them to the life in his own writings on Plato and elsewhere. This achievement amounts to, in my opinion, as great a recovery as Al-Farabi's, who discovered philosophy once more in the 10th century. The common thread in their recovery was no doubt their common understanding of revelation as the alternative to philosophy. But since the three revealed religions after paganism were already infected to various degrees by philosophy, they had to recover revelation in its true form at the same time as they recovered its opposite. For both purposes, Plato's Laws was their guide. Now, as a recovery, theirs might seem of less significance than the original discovery. But as both Al-Farabi and Strauss knew, the original discovery was itself not at the beginning of philosophy. Philosophy had to be rediscovered by Socrates long after there had been philosophy. Plato has Socrates call his rediscovery a second sailing. The second sailing is philosophy, and it is never first. The false start of philosophy can alone jumpstart philosophy. The caution and the daring that characterized all of Leo Strauss's works are conspicuous in his interpretations of Plato. One could say that for Strauss, the caution came from his beloved Xenophon and the daring from the divine Plato. But it would be more precise to say that Strauss always refused to separate Xenophon and Plato, and in this showed especially his difference from the interpretation of Plato that had come to prevail since the time of Schleiermacher. Strauss's caution appears most obviously in the extreme reticence he maintained when it came to the so-called Platonic forms. But his daring is thereby all the more striking when one realizes that his thought was always fixed on the beings, whether God, man, or beast, and the whole. Strauss was the master of the connection between the small and the large, or of the ways in which the one participates in and hence fails to be identical with the other. Strauss's mastery was such that its inherent difficulty does not strike home until one tries it oneself and comes up with quite arbitrary links that do not in fact take in all of the particulars and hence fall short of the truly general. There was at least one contemporary of Strauss who had an equally uncanny eye for the unnoticed but significant detail. What he noticed was surprisingly different from what Strauss did, but his ability to work up from it to the beginning and down from the beginning to the detail was no match for Strauss's. Strauss came to almost everything experientially. He shunned theories. It was what he had found out for himself that he most relied on. His reading of Plato was not different from his own thinking, not in the sense that his opinions were Plato's or Plato's his, but in the element of Platonic dialectic, Strauss saw and practiced his own way. One has to turn to Xenophon in order to understand the double sense contained within Platonic dialectic. This is a remark in the fourth book of the Memorabilia. Xenophon says that to converse, dialegistai, meant for Socrates the coming together of men for the purpose of deliberation by dividing, dialegein, the things, ta pragmata, by kinds, katagene. The middle voice, dialegistai, contains within it the active, dialegein. The communication among men involves the articulation of things. This Heraclitean insight into the double nature of Logos was the basis for Strauss's reading of Plato. He put this double nature into the title of one of his last books, The Argument and the Action of Plato's Laws. The "and" in that title is misleading. It does not mean that some sort of action is represented while the argument is being developed. It means that the action has an argument and that that argument is the true argument of the laws. That Strauss did not call his book The Argument in the Action underlies the initial separateness of argument and action in the Platonic dialogue and the latent community between them. Strauss was not the first to notice the dramatic setting of a Platonic dialogue. He was not even the first to suggest that the drama altered the apparent meaning of the argument. But what is peculiarly his was to see that once argument and action are properly put together, an entirely new argument emerges that could never have been expected from the argument on the written page. Something happens in a Platonic dialogue that in its revolutionary unexpectedness is the equivalent to the periagoge, as Socrates calls it, of philosophy itself. This turnaround, this periagoge, has a peculiar structure. It has to be experienced and can never be formulated in such a way as to allow one anything more than an anticipation of an equivalent turnaround in another dialogue. There cannot be a method, a methodos of thought in the thoughtful going after medienai of thought. The complete rationality of the ineffable seems to be around the bend and open to the charge of mysticism and obscurantism. But Strauss saw that such a consequence of Platonic dialectic was nothing other than the sobriety of the highest kind of madness, which is philosophy, that Socrates celebrates in the Phaedrus. There are two kinds of esotericism, ancient and modern. Swift represented one by the bee, which out of the sweet produces the sweet, and the other by the spider, which out of the foulest things produces the most beautiful web. The first kind is metaphysical esotericism, the second political. The first kind necessarily includes the second necessarily denies the first. The first says that it is in the nature of things that things are hidden. The second says that it is the nature of the city as now constituted that this is so. The second proposes enlightenment, the lighting up of things until nothing and no one are in the dark. The first sets out to disclose things in their hiddenness and show the reality of what appears. Strauss put this as follows: the problem inherent in the surface of things and only in the surface of things is the heart of things. This sentence is merely a rendering of what Al-Farabi says is the way to interpret Plato. The first thing Strauss was always doing in his study of Plato was to be a beginner. He knew how to start again, not as if he were starting for the first time, but really starting for the first time. It is what Strauss must have had in mind when he wrote to Gadamer that he could not recognize in Gadamer's theory of hermeneutic experience, which as such is a universal theory, his own experience as an interpreter, which made him feel the irretrievably occasional character of every worthwhile interpretation. This experience calls for a practice of being without habits. Socrates called it the practice of dying and being dead, and identified it with philosophy. This experience would be impossible were there not a hiddenness of things that metaphysical esotericism recognizes and reproduces through trapdoors in arguments. Socrates' account of the structure of the soul in the Republic is one such example. Only if one follows patiently the argument Socrates gives about desire can one see it turn upside down and discover that it is the presentation of desire by the thumoidetic part of the soul that has put on the mask of reason. It is then but a small step to apply this periagoge to the Thrasymachus of the first book, and realize that in the soul structure of Book 4, there culminates one part of the Thrasymacheian principle of the Republic, and such a culmination prepares the way for its elimination and the emergence of philosophy. All of this was known to Al-Farabi, who remarked that Plato combined the way of Socrates with the way of Thrasymachus. But it was Strauss who first gave the full argument and indicated how one has to proceed beyond what Al-Farabi had written. What is most remarkable in the history of philosophy is the simultaneous dominance and absence of Plato. It is as impossible to conceive of Aristotle without Plato as it is to recall Plato while reading Aristotle. The Platonic forms show up in the manifold of treatises Aristotle wrote, and Plato does not show up in the apparent separateness of those treatises, only to show up once more in the incoherence of the principles that do not allow Aristotle's treatises on the soul, on nature, and on being to be put together, even though they severally demand that they be put together. It is this kind of separation and combination that we are left to do on our own when we come to Aristotle, and that Plato has Socrates practice continuously. Strauss realized that this is what it meant for Socrates to replace efficient material and final causation with his hypothesis of ideas, which Aristotle pretends to be a fourth modality of causation that can be readily added to the other three, rather than an abandonment of causality as it was known before Socrates. This second sailing of the ideas was inseparable from the promotion by Socrates of the soul as a non-derivative principle. Ontology, epistemology, and psychology were thereby joined and hence transformed, and it was one of Strauss's most beautiful discoveries to put together logos, being, and soul. Strauss wrote up his interpretations of Plato's Euthyphro, Apology of Socrates, Crito, Euthydemus, Republic, Statesman, Minos, and Laws. It is not unreasonable to ask whether analyses so heavily weighted in favor of the political can do justice to Plato and do not distort Plato as much as the contemporary tilt in favor of the Phaedo, Theaetetus, Sophist, Parmenides, and Timaeus. It turns out, however, that what seems to be the unavoidable bias of the professional puts Strauss in a unique position to return to Plato in his entire range through political philosophy. The subtitle of Strauss's course on Plato's political philosophy was its metaphysical foundations. In his time, political philosophy had decayed so completely as to cease to be a part of philosophy. It had decayed so completely because philosophy had decayed so completely as to cease to be a part of philosophy. No, it had decayed so completely because philosophy itself had decayed so completely. The connection between political philosophy and ontology was not obvious. And the reason for this was the vanishing of the primary phenomena of the cave and their replacement by what Strauss called the cave beneath the cave. Strauss had to recover the cave in all its shadowiness before he could show the way out of the cave. This entailed the establishment of the fundamental character of the political in its double aspect, the nature of political things and the best form of the city. This double aspect can be said to show the simultaneous empiricism and idealism of Plato. Machiavelli understood the idealism by itself and accordingly failed to understand either its political ground or its philosophic purpose. The starting point for Strauss was simply the two questions Glaucon posed at the beginning of the second book of the Republic. But this starting point does not just hold for political philosophy, but for philosophy as such. The nature of the beings on the one hand, and on the other, the nature of the good. Forms of these two questions inform all of Plato's writings and all of human life. Of the two questions, the good is always first for us. We are willy-nilly oriented by the good. Philosophy after Plato had tended to forget this, partly because Plato had been so persuasive about the human good, and partly because the separation of philosophical disciplines could not keep the good as an essential part of each of them. The dialectical success of Plato in the articulation of things could not preserve the comprehensive reflection of Plato, which alone had made his success possible. The tradition of philosophy thus became unphilosophic, and philosophy could not be restored unless one could get back to Plato, where the part which is being and the whole which is the good are constantly shown in their mutual interference. Strauss, therefore, was always turning away from Plato to return to Plato, and turning back to Plato after the obstacles to such a return had been faced. In the history of scholarship, it is not easy to find anyone with as wide as range and depth of understanding throughout that range as Strauss, and such a successful union of disparate things speaks in a peculiar way for the soundness of his view that political philosophy is the eccentric core of philosophy. Strauss often spoke of his subjective certainty. What he meant by that was the experimental nature of his way of interpretation. Once he could frame a hypothesis as to the drift of an entire dialogue or a sufficiently complex argument, he would deduce from it the consequences that should hold in the text if the hypothesis were sound. The consequences could range from a word to an entire argument that should be present or absent from the dialogue. Strauss was thus able to deduce that soul does not appear in the euthyphro. What made this deduction subjective was not its willfulness, but that it could never carry the same conviction to anyone else who had not proceeded in the same way as Strauss had done. Indeed, some of these deductions would appear in print as spurious, as if what Strauss had really done was merely to construct a hypothesis to fit his observation. This appearance of specious serendipity is a necessity. I should remark that Strauss's favorite word for his discovery that a hypothesis had revealed something was beautiful. Once, when Strauss was discussing the Republic, he listed 7 examples that Socrates had given in the course of an argument, and remarked that from his experience, he had learned that the center in an odd number of items turned out to be the most important, either in the immediate sequel or in the larger scheme of things. We were bemused and impressed when, in this particular case, the argument unfolded in such a way as Strauss had claimed it would. A friend of mine, who was more skeptical than the rest of us, went home and took down from the shelf Montaigne's essays, counted their number, and looked up the central one. It was entitled On Vain Subtleties, and its theme was the importance of being in the middle. Perhaps the principle Strauss invoked most consistently in his interpretation of Plato was that of abstraction. On the basis of his long experience with the dialogues, he thought that the key to each dialogue was the determination of what was necessary for understanding the issue at hand and which was absent from the dialogue. This principle is the hermeneutic equivalent to the difference between a being as a part of the whole and a being apart from its being a part of the whole. Aristotle, for example, discusses being in the metaphysics in such a way that it would make no difference whether there was only one being in the universe, but he pays heavily for this assumption, since he must end up with only one kind of being, which strictly is, and from which the universe necessarily falls away. In Plato, however, the abstraction from something essential to the issue turns out to be the revelation of the issue, and its apparent absence a sign of the failure on our part to effect the turnaround of the argument. The most obvious question to raise about Strauss's principle is this: what is the principle that governs what Plato chooses to omit? After all, it would seem that any essential omission guarantees that nothing will be understood. There must be then reasonable grounds for the omission, and these grounds must lie in the nature of the thing as it initially comes to light. The abstraction must be grounded in an abstraction by opinion, which has failed to take something decisive into account. Plato's procedure is based on the idealism of opinion, or the vulgar Platonism of opinion, which is checked in turn by the Platonic doctrine of participation. It thus turns out that abstraction in Platonic dialogues brings together two principles. Nothing can be understood if everything must be understood, and nothing can be properly understood if one does not take one's bearings by the necessarily improper starting point of understanding. Strauss's most startling illustration of his principle is in his discussion of the Republic. What the Republic abstracts from, he says, is the body, the most obvious sign of which is that the city, which is formed to supply bodily needs and does so perfectly, has a class structure based on the soul by itself, and this despite the fact that Socrates introduced the city as the analog of the individual and not his body or his soul. The city, then, is the locus of idealism. It is shot through, and necessarily shot through, with self-misunderstanding. It is geared for the body and lays claim to the soul. In its usurpation, the city is essentially the locus of all alienation. It follows, therefore, that the city cannot make for happiness, and only if justice is radically reinterpreted as philosophy is Thrasymachus on this issue refuted. This last allusion to justice as philosophy, which occurs quite late in the Republic, calls attention to the most obvious character of Platonic arguments. They keep on moving and changing in the course of a single dialogue, so that one can legitimately ask whether it is ever possible to single out anything as conclusive, or must we simply go with the flow and not bother to pull together beginning, middle, and end? Does a dialogue make a whole, or is it rather an ever-moving series of insights and arguments that are not meant to come to an end? Or what exactly is gained in understanding a Platonic dialogue if the temporal flux of argument is integrated into the parts of a single whole? What Strauss came to see was that only if one were able to link up the temporal order with the part whole order would the true argument ever emerge. The dissonance of pattern and sequence is of a different order than their coincidence. It was through the transformation that a temporal segment underwent when it became part of the whole that Plato imitated the relation that always obtains between a part apart from the whole and a part as part of the whole. This imitation which never ceases to amaze, made it possible for Plato to preserve the Socrates who in never writing represents the truth that philosophy alone has no tradition within the perpetuation of philosophy in its necessary decline. Strauss's deconstruction of philosophy is thus not Heidegger's, who hurried past Plato to Parmenides and Heraclitus and bypassed Socrates. Strauss's second most important principle for the interpretation of Plato was the more obvious one. The dialogues were imitations because nothing in them was left to chance, but everything was in order, even though the circumstances of reason should not, it seems, partake of the same order as reason itself. The elevation of the circumstantial into the inevitable pointed in two ways. First, it reflected the fact that for us, the starting point is always our interest, and this good, however conceived, is the engine of all serious discourse. What is true for life is as true for philosophy, which alone among the scientific disciplines has no principles from which to start except from life itself. To begin to philosophize, then, is to encounter a question that has been incorrectly formulated. The question reflects the true question, but it is not the true question. A Socratic discussion always moves toward a disclosure of the true question and its answer that determines at the same time the degree of displacement that was in the original question and without which one could never have got started. Plato's imitation of the relation between the beings and the good as it first comes to light confronts us with certain difficulties. Once we have come to know the character of the perspectival, are we allowed to discard it and come face to face with the beings in themselves? Strauss's short answer is, only if the soul can be discounted at the same time and shown to be a derivative phenomenon. Granted that the occasion which Plato fixed upon does not and cannot stand for all other possible occasions in which an issue comparable to the one he chose would arise, it must still be the case that the occasion, for all its apparent particularity, is susceptible to thematization, that is, to a structural extension that is as general as any argument. This is where it is easiest for an interpreter to go astray and where Strauss was most sure-footed. His reflection on the setting of the laws in which the Athenian stranger is and is not Socrates leads him to show the structural resemblance between wine drinking and a discussion of wine drinking on the one hand, and on the other, the descent of the stranger and the ascent of Megillus the Spartan and Cleinias the Cretan. Such a reflection led him in turn to the Phaedrus, through which Strauss could understand why Cicero began his laws with borrowings in equal measure from Plato's Phaedrus and Plato's laws. Strauss's way of interpreting Plato so that it became the model of all genuine philosophy raises the question of poetry and its ancient quarrel with philosophy. Just as it is easy to recognize the difference between post-Platonic and pre-Platonic philosophy, despite the poorness of our sources for both, so it is no less facile to distinguish between poetry and philosophy, as long as one does not look to Plato and wonder whether he is a hybrid who, in putting paid to the issue of poetry for all subsequent philosophy until Nietzsche and Heidegger, did not resolve the tension between the poet and the philosopher in himself. Strauss was alone, I suspect, in showing the spuriousness of this apparently self-evident divide in Plato. One way of stating the issue is to raise the question of translation. For if one renders Plato idiomatically, so that one conveys what one believes is the sense and not the words, one has already decided that the poet Plato, who might appear to be a legitimate subject of this kind of rendering, is irreconcilable with the philosopher, whose arguments, everyone would agree, should be presented as accurately as possible. In a recent translation of the Symposium, the translator puts into heroic couplet 2 lines of verse that Agathon made up in honor of Eros. Eros brings, Agathon says, sweet peace to men and calm o'er all the deep, rest to the winds, to those who sorrow sleep. The translation seems flawless until one notices that rest is not the same as koite, which means either sleep or bedtime. The sleep of the winds points directly to Agathon's argument that Eros is the god of poetic production, by whose agency the metaphorical becomes literal. It seems therefore almost inevitable that translator introduces the couplet with the words Eros brings and not with Eros makes. Perhaps one could come to understand Agathon even through a non-literal translation. But Strauss alone, as far as I know, did understand him because he followed the argument down to and up from the details. Perhaps the most puzzling as well as the most unexpected aspect in Strauss's recovery of Plato and philosophy concerns the status of the Greek poets before Plato. Even if Plato does not open up the only way to the poets, it is certainly the most accessible way. Without Plato, the tragedies of Sophocles, to say nothing of Aristophanes, are almost lost to us. Their understanding of the city, particularly of its sub-political foundations and of the law, particularly the sacred law, would remain in darkness were it not for the light Plato brings to them. The logos of Plato unveils the muthos of poetry for the logos that it is. Once, however, this is acknowledged, the Socratic revolution in philosophy seems to be coeval with Greek poetry, which had realized from the start, with its principle of telling lies like the truth, the relation of argument and action. Homer and Hesiod, then, would have to be recognized as already within the orbit of philosophy. It is a remarkable fact, whose significance Strauss was the first or the last to see, that the only mention of nature, physis, in Homer has the meaning it has for Plato and not for the philosophers who preceded him. Strauss's recovery of Plato opened up the possibility of gathering into the fold of philosophy more than philosophy had ever dreamed of. I cannot end this discussion of Strauss on Plato without quoting Strauss's account of Plato's understanding of the philosopher, for it applies no less to Strauss in himself than to Strauss in his understanding of Plato. He wrote, "To articulate the problem of cosmology means to answer the question of what philosophy is or what a philosopher is. Plato refrained from entrusting the thematic discussion of this question to Socrates. He entrusted it to a stranger from Elia, but even that stranger did not discuss explicitly what a philosopher is. He discussed explicitly two kinds of men which are easily mistaken for the philosopher, the sophist, and the statesman. By understanding both sophistry in its highest as well as its lowest meaning and statesmanship, one will understand what philosophy is. Philosophy strives for knowledge of the whole. The whole is the totality of the parts. The whole eludes us, but we know parts. We possess partial knowledge of parts. The knowledge which we possess is characterized by a fundamental dualism which has never been overcome. At one pole we find knowledge of homogeneity, above all in arithmetic, but also in the other branches of mathematics and derivatively in all productive arts or crafts. At the opposite pole we find knowledge of heterogeneity, and in particular of heterogeneous ends. The highest form of this kind of knowledge is the art of the statesman and of the educator. The latter kind of knowledge is superior to the former for this reason. As knowledge of the ends of human life, it is knowledge of what makes human life complete or whole. It is therefore knowledge of a whole. Knowledge of the ends of man implies knowledge of the human soul, and the human soul is the only part of the whole which is open to the whole and therefore more akin to the whole than anything else is. But this knowledge, the political art in the highest sense, is not knowledge of the whole. It seems that knowledge of the whole would have to combine somehow political knowledge in the highest sense with knowledge of homogeneity. And this combination is not at our disposal. Men are therefore constantly tempted to force the issue by imposing unity on the phenomena, by absolutizing either knowledge of homogeneity or knowledge of ends. Men are constantly attracted and deluded by two opposite charms: the charm of competence, which is engendered by mathematics and everything akin to mathematics, and the charm of humble awe, which is engendered by meditation on the human soul and its experiences. Philosophy is characterized by the gentle, if firm, refusal to succumb to either charm. It is the highest form of the mating of courage and moderation. In spite of its highness or nobility, it could appear as Sisyphean or ugly when one contrasts its achievement with its goal. Yet it is necessarily accompanied, sustained, and elevated by eros. It is graced by nature's grace. Thank you. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Let me thank Professor Benardete for his lecture, first of all, and let you know that he is willing to address questions.
I would like to understand better the view of the ideas that both Leo Strauss and Leo paper and its connection with something that Chris Counts indicates is the center of your paper, the claim that political philosophy is the eccentric core of philosophy. You connect this connection, that there is something about the way Strauss understands the ideas of Plato with the centrality of political philosophy with a number of things. The second failing, the refusal to understand the ideas as causes in the traditional sense. The priority of the soul, its non-derivative characteristic. And the pre-cave situation of modern man. A number of things. And I'm trying to sort of think about some way of asking you to talk about this more. Perhaps this is a way. I could understand if political philosophy is the core of a kind of preparation for philosophy. If, particularly on this large issue of the relation between the intelligibility of the beings and the good in Plato, which also seems to be involved as another element. If if that were understood in itself a political way, that in the way the soul itself and its orientation to the good can obscure philosophy, that perhaps simply by living poorly, without realizing we are slaves of images, without akasia, with being trapped or chained in the cave, philosophy would not arise. And if the situation is even worse, if we're not even in the natural situation that it describes in Persecution of the Art of Writing, that passions and superstitions prevent us from thinking philosophically, we're even worse off. In that sense, political philosophy might be a core preparation for philosophy. We're not living well, and the way in which we're oriented to the good obscures the possible intelligibility of being. And thus, political philosophy would be a kind of necessary orientation, or at least even negatively. A dissatisfaction would have to emerge, as you were saying about the way in which philosophy is always a second sailing, with a dissatisfaction with the way philosophy is done. That all seems, in a way, more accessible and intelligible, but preparatory and negative as a task for political philosophy, is kind of clearing the way for something else. But I took it you were suggesting that in Strauss and your own reading of him, there is a deeper connection between the Straussian understanding of the soul, the relation between being and the good, the kind of intelligibility that the good or the orientation of the good makes possible, that makes political philosophy essentially the core of philosophy. That is almost all of what philosophy is. That part I have more difficulty with. So within that contrast, is there anything you could say that would make it clear why Strauss, on the surface, seemed only to be preparing for philosophy? That's beyond me, I'm just a humble beginner, that kind of language, in which political philosophy is preparation, and a more ambitious thesis that seems hidden in it, which is quite radical, the claim that what philosophy is essentially political philosophy. Is there anything you can say about that?
Well, the issue is this, whether, you can put it this way, if you look at the two terms philosopher and philosophy, it looks as though the first is the genuine term, and the other one is a reification of something that does not really fit the philosopher in his doing. But if it is true that one cannot be a philosopher, that is, one cannot turn around and say, I am going to begin to philosophize, but that one has to realize that there is a structure to philosophy to which there is no ready access. Then the distinction that you make, which sounds plausible, between preparation and philosophy proper, could not be made. So it looks as if Strauss's assertion, as well as Plato's claim in the way in which he presents his teaching, whatever it is that you always are on the way to being on the way. And that's very difficult to get a hold of. It looks as if the one can jump over, right? The most obvious sign of this jumping over is in the Republic, where the description of the escape from the cave does not depend on the Republic. So that it looks as if you go from the images of things, or the images of things, to things outside the cave without going through the Republic. So a prospect of the possibility of an openness to philosophy, right, is shown that is totally contradicted by the manner in which it is shown. So it is necessary, in order to understand what it would mean to ascend from the cave, to put the Republic into the ascent from the cave. Right? When that is done, right, then it turns out again that you have this double movement, right, in which it looks as if it is not possible to make this distinction between political philosophy and philosophy.
But a more radical way of thinking about it would be to say that we are, this would be a kind of theory of finitude, that the way in which things are intelligible to us, the way in which they can be rendered clearer or articulated, I think was your word, and thus the subject of communication between us, is somehow limited by the way in which the soul comes to experience itself in common with others and in the pursuit of the good. This connection between some sort of political phenomenon, apart from the issue of education or leaping, seems to suggest that Strauss thought that the fundamental issues in philosophy were somehow articulated only within the human pursuit of the good. That seems like a theory about limitation or finitude, or almost a religious thesis about finitude, which suggests that we ought to pay attention to the way things light up, make sense, are articulable within and only within the pursuit of the good.
No, I think, in other words, if you take the Republic as an example, right, what one sees very clearly there in the way, if you look at the beginning of the second book, one sees very clearly that Glaucon has split these two questions. So he asks Socrates a series of questions about the nature of the good, and then turns around and asks him a series of questions about the nature of what is just. Right? He thinks they're not connected with one another. And insofar as he thinks they're connected with one another, they are connected in a way which is contradicted by his own account of the good. So the argument of, if you take that as the model for all Platonic arguments, one has to begin by saying that the attempt to understand anything, although it is always guided by this other consideration, right, does not belong together with that consideration. That is why it necessarily always has to take the form of a periagoge. If you're constantly looking at yourself, you'll never get anywhere. So you have to abandon yourself in looking for whatever you're looking for, right? But that means that all understanding is necessarily retrospective, right? Because it only is after some part of the journey has been completed that you can understand why you, in fact, were on that road in the first place. Right? So if you look at the Republic is entirely constructed by Socrates splitting these two issues completely apart. We're going to look at the question about what is just, and then it comes as a complete surprise to the interlocutors that he suddenly says to him, well, once you've gone through this, we have to have the knowledge of the good. Right? As if that had not been part of the examination. That is part of the examination in the sense that had been the motive of their examining this being. Right? But they themselves didn't understand that is in fact that they were related to one another. Right? So the consequence was, to go back to Glaucon for a second, Glaucon had said, right, the highest kind of good, I think, and don't you agree, Socrates, is something like thinking, being healthy, and seeing. And then he had said, well, why shouldn't I be unjust? Because you could get all the goods. Now, what are all the goods that you can get by injustice? Certainly not thinking, seeing, and being healthy. Right? So he gives another list of goods that come from being unjust, right? That totally are contradicted by himself. That is, those are not the goods, right? So he goes inside the cave and takes the cave, the perspective of the cave of what constitutes human goods, right? Without realizing that he has done so. At the same time, he's standing outside the cave when it comes to an understanding of the good. So it then turns out that Socrates has a very difficult task, because he has to show Glaucon that Glaucon's real question, right? And this is where Strauss, I think, is most uncanny,